So look, I want to thank everyone for coming along today for this lunchtime online event. This is our Melbourne Connect event, Understanding 2020, which is Mindfulness for Health and Happiness. Before we begin, and for those attending today, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional owners of the land you are situated on, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years. So we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And thank you all very much for joining us. My name's Garry Williams. I'm the creative producer of innovation for Melbourne Connect, which is a part of University of Melbourne. And delivering this event for you today, this event series, the Understanding 2020 event series, is a collaboration between Melbourne Connect and the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. So we're very pleased to do this as a collaborative effort. These fortnightly events are essentially designed to delve into a range of topics focused on very current and relevant themes, with evidence-based research and leading social and clinical psychologists driving these discussions. So what is Melbourne Connect? I'm going to actually share my screen just for a little bit of context. Just bear with me. So it helps to, I guess, draw some association with what we're talking about and the types of activations we'll have within this precinct. So Mindfulness for Health and Happiness today with Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. More on Nicholas in just one second, but we're here to talk about activations and events that will likely occur within Melbourne Connect in the future. Here's some renders of the space. And for those who aren't aware, Melbourne Connect is a forthcoming innovation precinct being developed on the corner of Swanston and Gravin Street at the end of 2020. That's the site of the old Royal Women's Hospital, and it will essentially co-locate university researchers, industry partners, emerging talent, inventors, creators, and so on, in a very purpose-built, very innovative precinct. Located in this precinct will be the Melbourne School of Engineering, a Science Gallery Melbourne as part of their global network, Complex Human Data Hub, Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, Melbourne Accelerator Program, co-working, Fab Lab, Makerspace, you name it. It's going to be a precinct which can essentially hold 3,500 people at a time. And we're very aware, obviously, of the current scenarios we have in terms of restrictions on gathering, but we will gather again, and this will be an incredible precinct in order to do so. We'll be running events like these, just as I mentioned, and here is some indications of space, such as running hackathons, open public space, and more, where we will gather, present, learn, inspire, challenge, and more. So with that, we're here for Mindfulness for Health and Happiness today with Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. Nicholas, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciative to have you involved today.
Pleasure to hear.
So, Nicholas, I'm going to do the formal thing. So I'll talk about a bit of your background and your roles and title within the university to save you the effort of doing so. But then for everyone's awareness, what we will do is essentially launch into a presentation, and then after that presentation, launch into Q&A. So you can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, but we'll prepare you just before we launch into that. So Dr. Nicholas Van Dam is a senior lecturer in clinical psychology and is also the Deputy Director of the Brain and Mental Health Hub as part of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He's got an extensive education background. He's got Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and Neurobiology from the University of Wisconsin and a PhD in Clinical Psychology from the State University of New York in Albany. He's trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction and completed his PhD thesis on mindfulness-based treatment for anxiety and depression. His recent works, which you'll refer to a little bit today, include his widely cited paper, Mind the Hype, which is on mindfulness and meditation and is internationally recognised for its contributions. He's currently conducting some research, which you'll also hear more about, and that's also got a bit of a call out there at the moment for participants. But this research is exploring the relationship between the types of meditation practice and their potential effects on happiness and well-being. So very pleased to have you here with us, Nicholas. And what I'll do is I'll stop my share there. I've got you on the screen now. So look, without further ado, the flow today, it'll be just ourselves. Nicholas will present in just a minute. We'll be going to 1:30 p.m. maximum. We're recording this conversation, so we'll publish it on YouTube afterwards. And as I mentioned before, any questions you can pose in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If anyone has any difficulty seeing the presentation, you just scroll to the top and select fit to window, I believe, as part of your viewing settings. So Nicholas, I've talked at length. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
I know you've done a few presentations over the last few weeks, so we're going to keep this nice and warm and casual. But as I mentioned, people will probably pose questions at the conclusion of your presentation, but we might see some flow through. In the meantime, I'll put them forward to you if relevant.
Sounds great.
Cool. Well, look, I'll leave you to it. I'll mute and stop my video. Any issues, I'll jump back in, but otherwise we'll see you on the other side.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Nicholas.
So the title for today is Understanding 2020 as part of the series, and I'm going to be talking about mindfulness for health and happiness. Some of my contact details are there. I believe you've already seen my Twitter handle, but obviously my email is there as well as my personal webpage, which is much more easy to modify than my university webpage. So there's a lot more information going up on my personal webpage a lot faster than my university webpage. So the purpose of today's talk, from my perspective, is a much broader overview of kind of what mindfulness is, how it may contribute to health and happiness. I hope to address some of the myths, some of the misconceptions about mindfulness and meditation, and to also talk about some of what we know based on the research. It's very much intended for a general audience. If you have specific questions, or if you're looking to find out on what the latest science has to say, I'm happy to sort of give you some references, or even provide you with links to some videos in which those things have been discussed. I'm also happy to kind of tackle some of those things in the context of the Q&A session. But as I said, the general idea here is to kind of give a broad overview about what we know about mindfulness and meditation. So I like to start off a presentation like this sort of highlighting sort of this idea of when, or identifying at least when, mindfulness really became popularity. So popular, when do we start thinking about mindfulness? When did it sort of become part of our day-to-day vernacular and vocabulary? And so you can really interestingly see, so the figure on top is a worldwide comparison of Google searches for the term mindfulness relative to Scott Morrison. And so you can see, dating back to 2004, when Google started recording this information, sometime in about 2015, they updated their process to get it a little bit more accurate, and going through approximately today, or nearly today, you can see sort of that the search for mindfulness sort of has just steadily increased at a pretty sort of fast pace since 2004, in a way that perhaps worldwide Scott Morrison has not. You can see sort of Scott Morrison's popularity in terms of Google searches have kind of peaked here. Presumably this is sort of probably when he became the prime minister, and sort of probably there have been various events that we could spend time exploring and discussing, but we're not going to do that. But the interesting thing to note is that, you know, unlike sort of politicians and other individuals worldwide, mindfulness just has increased sort of steadily and without a whole lot of sort of scalloping, right? There's sort of not a whole lot of peaks and troughs. There's just a pretty steady increase here in its popularity. And interestingly, you know, I've sort of often presumed, or often thought, that we've hit peak mindfulness. And, you know, every time I do one of these, it continues to go up. So that would suggest that we haven't hit peak mindfulness, and that we continue to sort of explore, and people continue to be interested in the term mindfulness and what it is. On the bottom here, it may be a little bit hard to see the details. This is a graph from a paper that my colleagues and I published in the Perspectives in Psychological Sciences in 2018. The first part of it was called Mind the Hype. And here's a figure that represents, you've got on the y-axis on the left here, this is original scientific articles in academic journals, and the corresponding line for that is this black bar. And on the right, you've got articles in news media presentations, and the y-axis there sort of is over here. And so you can see sort of that there's this exponential growth in both research and media coverage of mindfulness since really when it kind of kicked off was kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s. So the Google Trends doesn't even really go far that back. And so what's interesting to note is sort of right around here, when things really start to pick off, it sort of coincides with some of the key work by people like Richard Davidson, the formation of an organization called Mind and Life in partnership with the Dalai Lama. And that's really when things started taking off, and when the mindfulness-based stress reduction program that Jon Kabat-Zinn developed really kind of became a popular program that was being offered and kind of recognized sort of at least nationally in the US, if not internationally. And then there's just this sort of incredible growth in interest, both in the scientific community as well as in the news media, and as you can see, in the popular community as well. So it really, the interesting thing, as I said, is, I kind of have always thought that, we've hit peak mindfulness, but it doesn't seem as if we have. It continues to keep growing. Now, as I sort of think about this as well, there's been a number of articles sort of recently, and going back even as far as the sort of early 2000s, but particularly sort of in 2015, 2016, 2017, there's sort of been this kind of backlash. And so here's an article from the New York Times around October of 2015 about the meditation madness. And it's a really great clip here that I have, that the author, Adam Grant, says that he's being stalked by meditation evangelists. And there's some truth to that. There's a lot of people that talk about meditation in a way that sort of they're truth tellers, they're converts, they're really convinced at all costs that this would work. And you can see sort of at the bottom here, he says, I have nothing against it, I'm just happy, I find it dreadfully boring. And the reply is, but Steve Jobs did it. And his response is, yeah, and he also did LSD. Do you want me to try that too? What I find particularly humorous about this anecdote is that the response here is LSD is dangerous. Science shows that meditation is good for you; it will change your life. And this is from the supposed evangelist. And this is in 2015, and now the reality is psychedelics, which is a whole other seminar. Psychedelics are sort of in as much demand and are as enthusiastic about sort of things like LSD and psychedelics as they probably are about meditation and mindfulness. And often these things go hand in hand. That's not to say they are the same, but they certainly are. A lot of people are sort of enthusiastic about both of them. So what is mindfulness? How do we think about it? What are we talking about? And the reality sort of is that what we're talking about is actually not very clear. And this is part of the point that my colleagues and I made in that paper that we wrote. Now, this is the way that Jon Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness. So he says that it's awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So there's this element of attention, so if you think about the spotlight of attention, where you're immediately directing your attention, it may be on me at the moment as I'm talking, it may be on your emails as you're sort of going back and forth between listening to me and attending to whatever it is that you have to deal with in your day-to-day life. The awareness part is interesting though, because that has something to say about what's going on kind of in the periphery, right? So as your emails ping, as you hear an alert for a new email, or maybe you got a text message, or maybe you got a new follower on Twitter, as I seem to have just accumulated a few, you get a ping and your awareness tells your attention to redirect. So there's something about that relationship between how you specifically focus on things and sort of this peripheral awareness. And that seems to be particularly important. But the other components here, the on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally, are things that are somewhat unique to Jon Kabat-Zinn's interpretation of mindfulness and meditation. And really interestingly, this idea has been challenged by many people, not the least of whom is actually Jon Kabat-Zinn himself. So in 2011, Jon wrote an article in the journal Contemporary Buddhism, which I also contributed a piece to. And he specifies that the word mindfulness, when they first started out their program, this program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, it was originally just called the Stress Reduction Program. And he added this term mindfulness. And he says that it was used intentionally as an umbrella term to describe the work. And that it was used in certain contexts as a placeholder for what he calls the entire Dharma. So I'll say a bit about that in a second. But more importantly, he said it was meant to carry multiple meanings and traditions simultaneously. So while he gives this kind of nice, back leaflet of a book kind of definition of mindfulness that most people use and know, the reality is that the term itself conveys a lot more. And it's a lot more complicated than just paying attention in the present moment in a particular way, non-judgmentally. There's a lot of stuff to it. And this is part of what, a lot of researchers and scientists and scholars have complained about, is that, you kind of hear people use the term mindfulness, but it's really difficult to differentiate one type of mindfulness from another. And when Jon here talks about the entire Dharma, he's actually talking about the Buddhist, the canon, the Buddhist text the Buddhist influence of how to meditate, what it means, how to do these practices, principles and ideas for how to live a good life, an ethical life, a moral life, on a life that sort of has purpose and meaning, the kind of notions of eudaimonia that Brock Bastian spoke about when he talked in this event a few weeks ago, or maybe longer. And so there's some of that. There's some of that flavor in John's definition, even though it's not there on the surface. So I just want to say a little bit about that notion. So what is the Buddhist idea of mindfulness? So we've all heard of sort of mindfulness presumably broadly, but how do Buddhists think about this? And a number of monks and nuns that I've interacted with often get a bit frustrated at our sort of co-opting or utilization of the term mindfulness, because their position is that at the end of the day, mindfulness is one part of a much bigger set of ideas. So for them, mindfulness is part of the way out of the fundamental realization of the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha sort of is often recognized, the historical Buddha, as sort of coining the Four Noble Truths, and really they boil down to the reality that nothing in life is permanent, and often in life we experience suffering. However, the nice thing about suffering is that there's a way to end it. So there's I've seen a lot of quotes recently sort of with this idea that pain is not optional, or pain is not optional, but suffering is. And I find that quote to be quite useful, this idea that pain is optional, or is not optional, but suffering is optional, to be quite useful, because it really captures this idea that while you can't stop yourself from feeling pain, or you can't stop yourself from being hurt, there is a way that you can stop yourself from suffering. It's not easy by any means, but there is a way to do it. And the way to do it, per the tradition, is in the Eightfold Noble Path. So it's this idea that there's a combination of wisdom, of sort of knowing a particular things, and sort of having a particular approach. So learning about the world as it is, and sort of having the right intentions in doing these practices, and sort of undergoing or living your life. There's a combination or a set of things that have to do with how you live your life, so a set of ethics and principles. And then, and only then, are there sort of really these practices, so there's mental development. And within that, there's a combination of things: effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And you'll note, and the reason that I highlight mindfulness here is for two reasons, is that among all of the stuff in this path, and it gets a lot more complicated, and if you're curious about that path, I have two references here for books that I think are particularly good for a crash course that's quite accessible to the lay person if you're curious about Buddhism. The book by Stephen Batchelor, Buddhism Without Beliefs, is a particularly nice book if you kind of want a secular angle on it. And the Rupert Gethin book, Foundations of Buddhism, if you're really curious about a much more traditional perspective, you can learn all about this stuff if you're interested. But really, the reason that I present this is that mindfulness is a lot more than just one thing. In the Buddhist context, it represents all of this stuff. And not only is it mindfulness, but it's right mindfulness. And right mindfulness is not necessarily to say that there's a wrong mindfulness. It's just to say, essentially, in the Buddhist context, this term right, or this translation for right, which is often samasati, is this idea that there's a particularly adaptive way about doing this, right? So there's an adaptive and a maladaptive way. And there's some useful examples here where people talk about, a sniper, a military sniper may be incredibly mindful. And that may mean that they're really well able to focus on exactly what they're doing. But there's debates and questions about whether what they're doing, which is ultimately killing someone, is ethical and is for good purposes. So without that right component, without that adaptive component, many people would argue that mindfulness is not really mindfulness, that it's something quite different. And that raises a whole lot of questions about using mindfulness for things like workplace productivity, and being happier, healthier, being better at what we do, versus sort of other endpoints or goals, such as achieving enlightenment. It's a very different set of goals, and how you go about doing these practices has very different implications based on what your goals are. All of this to say, the traditional context from which a lot of this stuff comes is very rich and is quite complicated. And so, when you hear someone talking about using mindfulness kind of in a workplace context, suffice to say, there's probably a lot more to it than they're perhaps telling you. So that said, I think the first thing that I need to address is, as a result of what I've just presented, is, do you need to become a Buddhist? No. You do not have to become a Buddhist. Is mindfulness Buddhist? No, it's not necessarily a Buddhist idea. You can do mindfulness practices in day-to-day life. You don't necessarily have to meditate even to be mindful. But there are a lot of ideas inherent in mindfulness, and particular versions of mindfulness, that are influenced by Buddhism. There are secular variations on these practices that can be incredibly helpful, but you do not need to commit to Buddhism as a religion or as a philosophy. You don't need to join a monastery or a nunnery and have your head shaved and take vows. You can do all of these practices without that. And so this is something that is hotly debated and contested recently, where a number of people are sort of saying, it is a Buddhist concept. It's fundamentally not a Buddhist concept. I think it's important to note that, to some extent it is a Buddhist concept. It's inspired by Buddhism, but you don't have to become a Buddhist to do it. So given that, you don't have to become a Buddhist, a couple of other sort of clarifying things. Mindfulness and meditation are not necessarily Buddhist, and really I think worthwhile noting that most Buddhist monks and nuns actually don't meditate. So we often have this idea that, well, Buddhism is what Buddhist monks and nuns do, but the reality is something like 90 to 95% of monks and nuns don't actually practice meditation. There's typically a select group of monks and nuns that are kind of designated as the ones who ought to be practicing meditation, and in the historical kind of temple or practice sort of groups or monastic settings, a lot of the monks and nuns were sort of charged with, maintaining the monastery, dealing with the lay population, translating the texts, etc. So it's worthwhile noting that not even all monks and nuns were sort of allocated or sort of allowed to engage in these practices per se. And there was various reasons for that I don't have time to get into. But so that is to say that at the end of the day, the relationship between Buddhism and meditation practice is not a one-to-one. It's not that, being Buddhist means meditating, or being or practicing or engaging in meditation means that you're Buddhist. Certainly many of the sort of popular styles of mindfulness and meditation are often coming from or drawing upon Buddhist ideas, but they're not equivalent. The other thing that I think people commonly think is that mindfulness is the same thing as meditation, and it's not. So meditation is a term that is used for a particular style of introspection, contemplation, and it can take a variety of formats. You can focus on the breath, you can focus on the body, you can focus on a mantra, a candlelight, all kinds of different things. So there's all kinds of different contemplative practices, and there are many within Judeo-Christian traditions, within other spiritual or religious traditions that can be very different, and sometimes also can be very similar and overlapping to Buddhism. So the idea of mindfulness then, in the context of meditation, mindfulness meditation is one particular style or type of meditation, but the concept or the idea of mindfulness is somewhat independent of meditation as a practice. Now, I would say that to really gain the most benefits of mindfulness, or really to sort of do mindfulness kind of well, you often need to do it in the context of meditation, but that's not to say that you can't benefit from kind of a mindful attitude or trying to be more mindful in your life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as this talk progresses. Now, there are many ways, if you're interested in the meditation side of things, there are many ways to go about doing that. And here's a list of the various ways that you can think about doing it. And it's important to note that these approaches are very different approaches. They're for very different goals, and there's some implications associated with how you go about approaching learning meditation as a result of these different options. And I would say at the end of the day, one of the things that you need to consider is what is it that you want to get out of it if you're looking to engage in meditation practices, or if you're looking to learn mindfulness. If it's a simplistic thing where you just want to be a little bit happier and you really only have 5 minutes per day, then perhaps an app or an online course may suit your needs. If you're really wanting to get into it, if you're really wanting to change your life and change the way that you think about things, you're probably going to need to do a little bit more than that. It's probably not just as much or as simple as a 5 minutes a day kind of exercise or a one-time course or reading a book. You're probably going to need to commit to a course or a series of training exercises, at least over a period of something like probably 12 weeks, although we don't entirely know. If you really want to achieve something like enlightenment, if you really want to transform your personality, if you really want to change some aspect of who you are for the better, so to speak, then you're probably talking about something like several years, if not a lifelong commitment. So at the end of the day, the way that you go about learning the practices are as much about your ultimate goals as they are about the practices themselves. So with that said, I want to address this common myth or idea that mindfulness is mindfulness is mindfulness, right? That all mindfulness types are the same. And the title here is meant to be repetitious, and it's meant to also point out that capital M mindfulness, as we might think of capital T truth, is probably different than little m mindfulness. So what mindfulness actually is, in maybe a traditional context, is quite different from the mindfulness that's used in the context of talking to a psychologist or a therapist. And the images here are meant to help you think through these sort of different styles of mindfulness or meditation practice. Obviously, what a Buddhist monk, and here's a picture of a well-known Buddhist monk, Matthieu Ricard, who is sort of identified as, in many cases and by a number of scientific studies, as one of the, or if not the happiest man alive. And here's Matthieu sitting at the foothills of the Himalayan mountains meditating. And Matthieu spends about 9 months currently a year in this location meditating. So what Matthieu does is not necessarily the same thing as what you might do in a yoga class or in an MBSR course. And that's also quite different from what you might do in your favorite app, right? How you go about using your favorite app, or what you see on television in the context of mindfulness and meditation. All of these things are quite different. And I also note this sort of idea of hashtag mindfulness, because it's worthwhile noting that there's a mindfulness industry, and it overlaps pretty substantially with the well-being industry, but there's a lot of money being made here. And so it's really important that you are aware of that industry, and you're aware of the fact that what the goals of maybe traditional mindfulness or even mindfulness in a healthcare setting might not necessarily be entirely overlapping with the goals of the mindfulness industry, which potentially in a lot of cases is looking just to make money. So hashtag mindfulness and what you see on Instagram, and when you see pictures of individuals saying that it's easy to be mindful when they're in these amazing and beautiful settings, that's probably a bit different than being mindful in difficult settings or in difficult circumstances. And mindfulness is not just about going on retreat in Bali, in my opinion. Obviously, it's a bit easier, it's potentially easier at least, to be mindful or to be present when you're on a beautiful beach than it might be when you're stuck in your apartment, if you're very extroverted for the third or fourth month in a row. So I would say that sort of mindfulness in the context of real life is potentially a little bit harder, but maybe also more meaningful. Now, there's a number of differences between these different types of practices. And I'm not going to belabor the point here, but what I really do want to say is that when you think about the different ways of learning or going about learning mindfulness, when you're talking about the Buddhist context or learning within the context of a tradition, often you're going to get a lot more than just a set of practices. You're also going to learn about principles, ideas, ethical commitments. When you're doing it in the context of a practice that I'll say is a mindfulness-based practice, so this might be something like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Mindfulness is at the root of the practice, but the practices are often influenced by Buddhist ideas or philosophy. That's not to say they are Buddhist, but they're often influenced or structured in such a way as to encapsulate certain aspects of those practices. Mindfulness in psychotherapy. So in this context, it's used in a particular way to achieve the resolution of issues in mental health. So it's not necessarily meditation always. Sometimes it is, but often it's really largely focused on helping people to be more adaptive in terms of managing their cognitions, emotions, and behavior. So you may do short mindfulness exercises, and that's often quite different than the kinds of meditation practices that you might do in either of the first two types, in the Buddhist practice or in the mindfulness-based practices. And then finally, at the end of the day, there's this what I would call hashtag mindfulness. And perhaps this is a bit controversial, but that's the point of these kinds of seminars and discussions. And I would really say that hashtag mindfulness is all about plastering over a bigger problem that you don't really want to address. And, if you want to add that little caveat on the end, that you want to look good while you're doing it. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of people out there that are quite prepared to spend a lot of money, that are prepared to sort of provide you with something that looks like it's solving the problem, but it doesn't actually really help you to address anything real in the nature of that problem. It just looks like it might be doing it, and maybe the people that are doing it look good while they're plastering over that problem. So it's really important at the end of the day to note the difference between all these different types of practices. Now, if you're looking for a mindfulness-based practice, what does that look like? So this paper came out in 2017, and it's incredibly useful And as you're thinking about, is what I'm doing really mindful, or is it inspired by mindfulness-based traditions? I think this paper really highlights some of what you would be looking for. So one of the things that they say is that it's influenced by contemplative tradition. So it doesn't have to be a Buddhist contemplative tradition, but it does have to be a contemplative tradition. It could be Christian, it could be Judaic, it could be Islamic, it could be any contemplative tradition, but there should be some traditional background there. It focuses on the causes of human distress and the pathways to relieving that distress. So it's sort of similar to that knowledge of the Buddha, or those philosophies of the Buddha, that part of life is suffering, but there are ways to sort of avoid suffering. And again, while this is a Buddhist concept, we can probably recognize that that sort of idea or those principles will apply well beyond just context of what the Buddha was talking about. That's sort of just something that's fundamental to life, and there's nothing Buddhist per se about suffering and or well-being and wanting to have more of the latter and less of the former. The last thing, though, is that we would typically think of a mindfulness-based practice, and certainly Crane and colleagues think of it this way, as requiring or entailing sustained intensive training. So the idea here is that doing mindfulness things, mindful coloring in, or mindful jogging, or mindful eating, probably isn't enough to really fully cultivate mindfulness and really cultivate the ideas that go along with it. So if you really want the bigger and longer term benefits of this stuff, you probably need to engage in some kind of intensive training or program in some way, shape, or form at some point in time. What are the potential benefits? And this brings us to an important myth about mindfulness or meditation, which is that it can fix just about anything. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen all kinds of flashy headlines about what mindfulness is good for. It's great for, and I'm paraphrasing some of the headlines, it can supercharge your brain, it can increase your productivity, it can help you be a better parent, a better partner. The reality sort of is it's not a panacea. The traditional context, the traditional ideas behind mindfulness and meditation, they weren't designed to fix all of the things that we're applying them to. Really within the context of, and it's really interesting to think about this, within the context of traditional Buddhism, thinking about sort of utilizing meditation practices to make you a more effective salesperson, that's pretty antithetical to what a lot of the traditional Buddhist context would have suggested. So I've got a little note under here that sort of says everything and nothing in terms of what it's good for. And the reality is, it seems to be helpful for a lot of different conditions when you compare it against non-specific controls. In other words, it works compared to mostly nothing. But when you start to compare it against traditional treatments, evidence-based treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy, it doesn't necessarily look like it's performing better. Now, that's not a bad thing per se. If something performs as well as the best treatment we have out there, that may be a very good thing. But the reality is we don't necessarily have the kinds of studies that we would need to really ascertain whether or not at the end of the day, mindfulness sort of is actually comparable to something like CBT. And at the end of the day, it's going to depend a lot on what you're trying to achieve. So I already emphasized this idea of goals. I think in terms of what you're trying to benefit from or how you're trying to benefit, particularly if it's a health-related issue or well-being related issue, it's going to be really important that you consider different types or different forms of mindfulness or meditation. It's also worth noting a common myth that meditation is harmless. So a lot of people will say, what does it matter? It can't possibly hurt, so why not give it a try? The reality is that it's not entirely harmless. Now, it's not everybody that experiences these things, but there is a small percentage of people who do have pretty extreme experiences while they're meditating. They can experience things like hallucinations. They can experience manic episodes. They can have severe anxiety attacks. They can experience suicidality. Some people experience uncontrollable bodily tics. Derealization or disconnectedness from your body is something that people experience. The idea that I was presenting was really that it's not entirely harmless and there are some side effects. Now, we don't entirely know as much as we'd like to about these, but our rough estimates suggest that we're talking about on the order of probably about 5% of individuals. And what that tracks with is the sort of adverse experiences or negative effects that we often observe in the context of psychotherapy. So the reality is that some people get worse in the process of us trying to help them. And in the context of things like in these types of meditation meditation practices and in the context of things like retreats, some people, albeit a small percentage, do experience these negative effects. And so I think this argument that meditation is entirely harmless is something of a problematic one, because it encourages people to engage in this, suggesting that, well, it's not going to hurt you, so you might as well try it. It could actually hurt you. And so I think it's really important to note, if you've got a family history of mental illness, if you've got an untreated serious mental illness yourself, that this may not actually be the best place for you to start. And you may want to consider other things. So what about digital apps? There are a ton of these, and there's a plethora of them on the market. There's a variety of, inspirations for them. There's a variety of ways in which they've been developed. There's a variety of how they offer the practices. We don't really know much about them. There's been very few studies looking at whether or not they work comparably to what happens in in-person training. Some of them seem to be pretty good, and from my review and from other colleagues' reviews, but others of them are very superficial. And they suggest doing things that seem counterintuitive, and that don't seem to fit with things like what I would suggest you do if you're trying to relax as a psychologist. So look, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing if you're exploring digital apps is that you really do your homework and try to understand who are the people that have developed it, what do they have to gain from their efforts in developing it, do they have consultants from contemplative traditions, do they sort of, don't sort of assume that just because it's a clinical psychologist who sort of is involved in the process of making the app that they know what they're doing, or because it's a prominent psychiatrist that they know what they're doing. You would really hope that there's been a decent amount of time and effort and energy that has gone into consulting lots of people, not just sort of business stakeholders, and making the app look nice. Another important thing to note is that a lot of the apps sort of promote that it's sort of, the reality is that, you can achieve all the benefits of this and more in just 5 minutes a day. And I have a picture here of, from a traditional sort of Buddhist context, the idea of sort of how long it takes to, and the path that you have to take to really achieve the benefits of traditional meditation practice. And I won't go into the details of this. I'm happy to sort of talk about it individually or sort of in a different context. But the reality is that it can be a really long and very difficult process and path for a lot of people. So this idea of just 5 minutes a day may be really helpful for sort of some minimal benefits, or sort of just being a little bit happier. But if you're really looking to transform your personality or your life, or if you're really looking to sort of achieve something like enlightenment, it's probably not a 5 minutes a day endeavor. If you're trying to understand who should teach it, or how to figure out who to go to for instruction, the most important thing that is that you sort of check their credentials and sort of check where they're coming from. I think someone who sort of says they took a single course, and this is where this cartoon from. If you sort of can't make out the caption on the bottom, it's a picture of two pilots passed out, and a guy in the back sort of saying, "No sweat, I got an hour on a simulator for my birthday." And I see a lot of this, and this is actually a cartoon I borrowed from one of my colleagues, Josie Jimenez, who teaches mindfulness. And she likes this cartoon in particular because there's so many people out there that are prepared to offer mindfulness training, or with very little background in themselves, right? So they've taken a short course, or have learned about it, and they may not be sufficiently skilled or trained in the processes and practices to really help you through it. So that's important to know. One thing that I always like to talk about when I present this as well is the kind of contractual obligations. And look, I think what's really important here is to really explore what you want to get out of these processes and practices. And so this is a quote here that I really like from a 2004 film called I Heart Huckabees. And there's a scene where Jason Schwartzman, who's kind of the main character in the film, is having a discussion with some existential detectives. And he sort of says he wants to understand reality. He wants to know the big truth. He wants to understand everything there is to know about life. And the response that he gets is that we see a lot of people in here who want to peer under the surface at the big everything, but that this can be a very painful process that's full of a lot of surprises. It can dismantle the world as you know it, and most people would prefer to remain on the surface. So maybe you should just go home and let sleeping dogs lie. So I put this up here because I think there's an important point that looking sort of, looking under the hood, sort of exploring the depths of your mind can reveal things to you that you may not want to see. And it's really important that you be prepared for what can come up in this exploration, and that you're prepared and you have a good sort of guide in that process. And so, look, the reality is not everybody is prepared to engage in sort of the full-on kind of meditation practice, and it's not for everyone. So I think it's important to think about, what do you want to get out of it and what do you hope to get out of it? Now, the reality sort of in the post-COVID world, or the world that we find ourselves in, is that the forms and ways in which mindfulness and meditation are being offered have changed a lot. So lots of really great centers are offering free practices online. Tricycle Magazine has a whole list of them. On my website, there's a list of resources where if you want to go and learn about meditation, you can learn from some of the experts around the world. There's also lists of lots of local people that are prepared to sort of take you through this journey. And there's also sort of, as I said, a lot of apps, although you want to spend some time thinking about it. Now, I'll conclude in sort of just talking about some of the questions that I'm exploring currently with my lab and with my colleagues in terms of things that we want to know. We don't really know what best practice is in meditation. In terms of thinking about this in a clinical or health setting, there's a lot of unknowns here. We don't know what conditions it's best suited for. We don't know who the best teachers are. We don't know the extent to which apps work. We don't know which ones work. We don't know how well they work. We don't know for what conditions they work. We don't really know how to tell people whether or not a practice is working per se. It really depends on the goals, but we haven't really explored this in as much detail as we need to. We don't know how much practice you need to do. This is a study we're currently looking into, and that was already referenced. We're trying to figure out the relationship between amount and type of practice and potential benefits. The amount of practice that you potentially have to do is going to vary depending on your goals, right? If you just want to be a bit calmer versus managing a mental health condition versus achieving liberation or enlightenment, presumably that's going to be a very different amount of practice and potentially a very different type of practice. And ultimately, we don't know what the best way to learn these things are. Now, presumably it's going to vary based on individual differences, so based on you and who you are and what you want, but it may be that there are certain types of techniques that are better on average for most people, and we still don't really know that. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to sort of explore or answer any questions that may have resulted from my somewhat long conversation, as well as my NBN interruption. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. No need to apologise. I've had all manner of strange things happen, including deliveries to my front door while conducting events such as this. So I've seen plenty along the way. Let's we've got about 15 minutes left. As I mentioned to everyone, we'll finish at 1:30 on the dot to leave you to the rest of your day. Let's touch on, I guess, technology or companies utilising technology. So I've seen some statistics about some of the research that you've been conducting, and you've mentioned, I guess, platforms or companies such as Insight Timer, who has had a particularly large uptake from a number of respondents to some of your research. Mm-hmm. Claire Mullen has also asked in regards to any research on Smiling Minds app, which is encouraged in schools. So do you want to talk to us about, I guess, some of the providers utilising technology to bring mindfulness to the masses, essentially?
I would say, just about everyone is using technology to sort of try to encourage or to sort of facilitate mindfulness. And I think, at the end of the day, in a recent Q&A panel, we were chatting with Patrick Carney, who's a long-term meditation instructor. And he sort of said, look, at the end of the day, apps are fine if you've only got a few minutes per day. But if you really want to get into this, you probably need more than an app. So if you're looking, if all you can really allocate is a few minutes a day and you really just kind of want to understand the basics, some of the apps are really great. I personally think the apps are great for helping you to track your practice. A lot of what this requires is commitment to a practice on an almost daily basis, if not daily basis. And it's quite hard to actually find the motivation to do that. And so setting a plan and kind of, planning it out with a particular app and sort of tracking your practice over time is something that I find to be incredibly helpful. And I think Insight Timer is actually really great for that. And I think what I see and what we've seen in sort of our stats is that a lot of people use Insight Timer because it really does have this excellent timer component, and it provides you with all helpful statistics about how often have you been practicing, how long have you been practicing for. So there's a lot there. That said, Insight Timer is an interesting platform in that they don't really curate their content. Other programs such as the Headspace app or Calm or Smiling Mind, they really, the goal of those programs is to provide you with instruction in a very particular way. So it's much more curated. The unfortunate reality, in particular with, say, Headspace or with Smiling Mind, is that there's very little research being done. And even less research that's actually being published. So these companies actually have spent a decent amount of time trying to do research. From what I know, there's been a hell of a lot of white papers, but not very many publications. So Smiling Mind's a great example. They've funded, they've started or kicked off a lot of research programs, but there have not been very many publications reporting the results. And this is a bit problematic for me. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that when you try to distill some of these practices into a simplistic, few minutes a day kind of app format, you're not getting the same kind of thing that you would get in sort of actually going on retreat or talking one-on-one with a teacher. That's not to say it's a bad thing, but I suspect that, when we look at the kind of the plethora of results that we see in the research, they're often related to a course like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an 8-week intensive program. And so using an app is definitely not the same thing. Now, I'm only aware of actually one published study from Smiling Mind. And that study is sort of kind of mixed. It looks okay. We've got another study that I've been involved with and working on right now that sort of suggests, particularly in the school context, that it actually is really hard to get teachers to understand how to teach kids mindfulness and to help them figure out how to actually integrate it into their day. So I would say at the end of the day, it's not enough to just give people an app. That's not going to fix the problem. So I think, there's a sort of capitalization on an app which is easy to deliver. And I think it can be a great way to facilitate practice, but I think it's not going to fix fundamental problems. If you really want mindfulness in schools, you have to think about the structure of the school day. How is a teacher going to work that into the classroom space? And that's something that I don't think that we've really grappled with. I think we've thought about how do we develop these apps. We haven't really grappled with how do we use them effectively.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. And obviously something to be well aware of in regards to, look, I guess it's very easy, I guess, in another way of saying that as we've been addressing throughout this event, which is around, I guess, the influence of pop culture and particularly published content, specifically during sort of COVID-19 time, I myself sort of saw a proliferation of lots of mindfulness-based focused content that coming through publications such as your broadsheets and pedestrians and highly shareable, I guess, snackable content. And so from that, I guess it warrants some further investigation into what is the most apt or relevant sort of mindfulness practice for people that are sort of becoming aware of it relatively quickly. I would love to address this one just before we get towards the end, which Tim Percy posed quite early. He's asked, would you say that media interests led and demanded scientific interest in mindfulness between the years 2000 and 2015? So he's essentially asking about media interests and how that influenced, I guess, public perception or advocacy.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think this is something, in a number of discussions that I've been having recently with Shannon Harvey, who has just released this film, My Year of Living Mindfully, which we hosted a screening of. One of the things Shannon and I have talked about this a lot. To what extent does the media influence which scientists get the pedestal, so to speak, and to what extent does the media sort of influence what studies are done? I think quite a bit. I mean, I think in the early days of this, there were only a few well-known researchers. There were only sort of a few well-known people that were really working together, or working quite closely, and had a very clear plan about how to kind of develop mindfulness and meditation and kind of to repopularize it. There was a white paper. There's a book called The Mindful Elite by Jamie Kusinkis that talks about a lot of the history of the current mindfulness movement from a sociological perspective. They've really had a really solid plan in terms of how to reboot it, rebrand it. They were very aware of what happened with the transcendental meditation movement, that it crashed and burned. And so they were very cautious, and they partnered very specifically. A number of the sort of prominent researchers capitalized on interest from people like Dan Harris. and found a way essentially of utilizing interest from popular political figures, news media figures, to really try to ensure that things were getting covered. And sort of in creating this loop, certain individuals kind of keep appearing talking about mindfulness and meditation. And so outside voices of people saying, hold on a minute, not all the research is being done as thoroughly as it should. Maybe the cart's a bit ahead of the horse. Up until recently, a lot of those voices haven't been acknowledged. I think we're now at a time where there's enough. Everyone's heard so much about mindfulness and meditation that a lot of people are starting to get a bit sick of it. And as a result, I think people are starting to ask for quality, not quantity. And that's where sort of, and the media has actually also played a role in that. And they provided an opportunity and an avenue for people to speak up, including myself, and say, actually, there is some really great stuff out there, but you have to create a platform, or you have to create the option for people such as myself and others who sort of will cut through the garbage and sort of to give a clear message about what works and what doesn't.
I think because I'm making some presumptions, but a lot of people may lean on, I guess, some advocates of it to become aware of the concept of mindfulness. But then, of course, they need to educate themselves and further dive into what does good mindfulness practice look like. I want to loop back on what you referenced very quickly. I know that you appeared on the talk after, I guess, a showing or a premiere of this film recently in interesting circumstances, of course. My Year of Living Mindfully, so health journalist Shannon Harvey put meditation and mindfulness to the test. She travelled all around the world. Her question was, could learning to quiet our busy minds be the solution the world so desperately needs? And she's searching for the mental equivalent of a 30-minute daily workout. What have you sort of gleaned from, I guess, a film experiment to put mindfulness further on the conversation for people to consume?
I mean, it was a very interesting process, and we were really hoping, Shannon and I and a couple of other colleagues had actually tried to propose a research study to be done off the back of the film. So we were actually trying to, and we're still exploring this possibility. A couple of potential funders could have said no, but we sort of still are somewhat optimistic, and we're running a pilot study now to kind of explore this idea. We were hoping that we could basically do something like, hey, if you're inspired by this idea, if you want to do this experiment yourself, because Shannon's enterprise was herself. It was one person, and it's really hard to conclude from one person in a scientific sense whether or not anything works. So we were hoping to basically allow for people to do the same thing. If you want to sign up for a month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year of living mindfully, of doing these practices, we'll help you. That's still something we very much want to do. And sort of increasingly, that's something I've been thinking about a lot myself. And I'm exploring that, whether we can do that, whether we can help people sort of learn how to do mindfulness, to track their progress, to engage in this. But look, the film itself was very interesting. It was a really interesting thing to be involved with. One of the most interesting aspects of the film and of the sort of results, so to speak, of the experiment was that none of the scientific findings were particularly strong or robust. That there weren't really anything, so to speak, in terms of scientific findings. But what Shannon talks about is that her well-being was dramatically improved. Like she didn't necessarily feel happier or better per se, but she felt calmer. So this idea of subjective well-being, of well-being more broadly, not you're going to feel happier, but more balanced. That was sort of the most pronounced thing that she observed, and that's something that I can sort of testify to. That a lot of people talk about it, and we do see a lot of evidence of. And I think it's a really interesting process, and we need to do better at figuring out how to partner between scientists, media individuals, and sort of the experts in contemplative practices to work together to figure out how to guide people in this process, while also sort of documenting certain aspects of the process. Because as scientists, we often are quick to stick people in an MRI machine or to draw blood or to sort of do classic laboratory tests. But maybe the benefits that you get from these kinds of practices aren't going to show up as obviously, on a brain scan. And so that's something that I've really it's opened my eyes a bit more even to that idea that, well, where should we be looking? Because I think there is a lot of potential here.
Yeah, wonderful. Look, thank you so much. So let's touch on My Year of Living Mindfully. So where can people access that film at the moment?
So you can see there's a number of trailers related to Q&As and things like that, and also the trailer for the film itself. Shannon's website is myyearoflivingmindfully.com. I believe the film now is sort of discounted, but you do have to purchase it now. There are, as I said, there are a number of Q&As that have been done in relationship to the film itself, which are available on YouTube. I'll be updating my my personal webpage to sort of include some of the various Q&As that have been done in relationship to this film, within the next week as well.
Okay, fantastic. And look, I want to very quickly, as we veer to the end, I want to quickly touch on the research study that you're doing at the moment, which is part of the Brain and Mental Health Hub. I believe you're looking for participants or people who are involved in either diving into mindfulness or potentially already established in incorporating it in their day-to-day lives. Is that correct?
Yeah, so look, what we're trying to understand is sort of the relationship between the type of practice and the amount of practice that people do, and how that relates to potentially well-being or potentially even sort of mental health, right? So what we want to know is like, what's the relationship? So, is there a particular number, or is there a particular point of practice per week or sessions per week or whatever of a particular type of practice that seems to be linked to particular outcomes? So either improved mental health or improved well-being. So really the only way that we know for this to work, we've designed this experiment to be incredibly low burden. So we've designed the surveys to be incredibly short, and we're going for really large numbers. So our hope is such that, essentially if we can get a large enough number of people to participate in the study, we can start to answer this question of what's the relationship between type and amount of practice and potential benefits. So we've had about 1,000 people sign up for the study already, but we're looking for much more. And the goal basically is, anyone who either has an established mindfulness or meditation practice, or anyone who is interested in having one, that they're welcome to join in the study, and we're happy to sort of provide some advice in terms of how people can learn to meditate or practice mindfulness if they're interested.
Yeah, amazing. Look, thank you so much, Dr. Nicholas Van Dam. I really appreciate it. We always verge to 1:30 p.m. at a rocket pace when we get to the end. So, but I did want to basically leave your details up there for people to have a look. So do dive into Nicholas's Twitter handle, which is listed there, NT Van Dam, and also the School of Psychological Sciences for further research and findings. Look, thank you so much for being a part of it. Tech difficulties happen. It's part and parcel of the nature of working from home, basically. For those who have attended, we had about 80 of you today, so very pleased to have so many join, and probably quite a pertinent discussion for you all. We will publish this online via our YouTube channel, so do look out for the Melbourne Connect YouTube channel and also through our social media channels for the talk to be published upcoming, and share and gather some of the resources that Nicholas has shared throughout today. On that, the next Melbourne Connect event will be on next Wednesday, June 24th, on advancing creative invention. But I want to thank you all very much for being a part of today. We'll see you on the other side. Catch you very soon. Thank you.